On behalf of Rosslyn, I'd like to welcome you to this remarkable memorial. A building designed by Lorimer, paid for by public subscription, and opened by the Prince of Wales in the summer of 1927. A national acknowledgement of the grief that people felt at the end of the Great War, and an ongoing recognition and expression of respect for those who have given the ultimate sacrifice in all the conflicts that have followed since then. Tonight is broadly split into two parts. Rosslyn and I are going to have a conversation where she's going to answer questions and make some readings from her book, and then we'll have a question and answer session for as long as it gives you pleasure. So Captain John Orr's story was lost to time, Rosslyn. He had all sorts of notable service along his life. There was important archive material and uniform that was in a chest that nobody had seen for 100 years or more. And I wonder what you felt like and how you first came across this cornucopia of memorabilia, and indeed whether you thought at the outset you were going to write this.
Well, the answer to all of that is, as Euan said, it started with a cabin trunk. The cabin trunk had been in my family, and my mother and I had opened it from time to time in the past, but we'd never gone through it systematically. She had told me that it held the Peninsular War diary of my great-great-grandfather, who was Captain John Orr, some notes he wrote. It also contained details of the Scottish Naval Military Academy, some important documents in there. And I only really started to look at it seriously when my husband Euan died in 2009. And I then thought I need to go through this systematically. And I found rapidly that there should be certain documents that should be archived. So I started to do a bit of research in order to substantiate a submission. I never, at that time, thought of writing a book.
Well, that's all very clear, but something changed, obviously.
Well, gradually over the years, I did more and more research. And I began to wonder, perhaps there's enough to self-publish an article or a book or something. And then more and more research was done, and people suggested that there really was enough for a book. Then COVID came, and COVID was very helpful to me. Not that I got it, but I was stuck in Edinburgh with the archive. I couldn't go anywhere, and yet I could do research. I could use that, as many of you know who do research, that blessed resource, the British Newspaper Archive. I could order books. I couldn't go anywhere, but I sat, I researched, and I wrote. And at the end of that, it looked more like a book. And I had suggestions from some of the people here that there was enough for a book. So I tried a commercial book. So I tried two publishers. They would publish it for me, but they wanted me to pay for it. But the third time I tried was Pen and Sword, and they took me on.
So from all our conversations that we've had, there's an enormous amount of material. What were the standout events or stories that you would draw to our attention?
Well, I suppose the first and major thing was reading John's Peninsular War diary. It's a very small book, but it's reading something that's been written while on a campaign is very special. And then I was extremely pleased to be able, at the end of my research, to put the story of the Scottish Naval and Military Academy together. It had been forgotten about by a lot of historians, mainly because the stuff was in the trunk. And then the other thing that gave me huge pleasure was the characters that I found doing research. Some of them were directors, some were masters, but it was the pupils that really fascinated me. One was Charles Naismith, who was the hero of Silestra, which was the start of the Crimean campaign. He was never well and he died young. For his bravery at Silestra, he got the honour of being at Edinburgh. Got to him. His father was a dentist here, dentist to the Queen Victoria. And then there was Henry Stuart Wortley, who was served in the army. He served in Africa and then in the Crimean War, and then he retired and he took on professionally what was a hobby, which was photography. And his early photographs of landscapes, of seascapes of morning and night are gorgeous. I have one in my book. And it was just extraordinary how this man produced this work. And lastly, because there are lots in the book, but I'll just say one more, was John McDougall Stewart, a well-known name in Australia. He was a wee man from Fife, and he was too small to go into the army, and so he went to Australia, and he was heroic. He made a heroic journey, the first Westerner to cross Australia from south to north. The main road now from just north of Adelaide up to Darwin is called the Stuart Highway after him. He's well known there.
Now we're going to hear a fair bit about John, but can you tell us something about him so that we're all on the same page at the start?
About John, do we? Well, John was born in Greenock in 1790. He was early orphaned, and he joined the Stirling militia when he left school. He then rapidly moved to the Edinburgh militia, and within about a year, they were all ordered to go to Colchester. There were a lot of British Army regiments were abroad with various commitments and battles and things. And John found when he was there that regiments were commissioning officers without their having to pay for it. It was extremely expensive to get a commission. And so he managed to be commissioned into the 42nd Regiment of Foot, the 1st Battalion, as an ensign. And about 4 or 5 months after that, in April 1812, he was on board 3 ships sailing to Lisbon to fight in the Peninsular War. That was a war that was Britain was summoned to help Portugal, who'd been invaded by France and Spain.
Thank you. Now, as somebody who was once a soldier and spent some time writing handwritten diaries when I was on operational service, I'm absolutely fascinated to learn, of course, that he kept a diary, and it would be really interesting to hear from you what you thought about what he wrote.
Yes, well, I'll tell you a little first about the actual diary. It's very small, a little notebook, lost its cover, and he calls it a campaign diary, and that's what it is. So you're not expecting a large, verbose, I wish it were bigger, but he is just concerned with where he marches from day to day, where he's stopping. He's interested in his surroundings, but I wish he would talk more about himself and more about people, because it is really about places more, isn't it? Mm.
Now, I think for us to get a feel for what his military service was like, would you be kind enough to read just a few passages?
Yes.
Which I see are beautifully flagged up in your
book.
Well,
yes, it would be.
Rather better than mine, I see.
Well, let's hope the flagging works. One. This is the first entry. It's a larger entry than normal. He's just landed in Lisbon. You have to remember he's a 22-year-old who's never been abroad before. It's all very exciting. And he says, Lisbon is a very fine town, but rather irregular, and the streets dirty, as they take no trouble in cleaning them, although it would be very easily done. The town, with an exception of a small part, stands on the face of a hill on the side of the Tagus. The country all around is most beautiful and in a high state of cultivation. I went to see the Church of Sao Roque and was shown some elegant silverwork and some beautiful mosaic paintings. I also went to the opera and saw some fine dancing. And then I'm going to mix these with some notes that he wrote in old age as well, and this next one is a bit he wrote in old age. Very soon after they arrived in Lisbon, they, what is called, got the route, and they are setting off through Portugal up to Ciudad Rodrigo to join the Allied Portuguese army. They get only as far as Nisa, and they decide that they're going to reorganize the regiment. And they decide that the 2nd Regiment, who'd been in Spain for some time, should go back to Scotland. And they decide to also send some of the younger officers from the 1st Battalion, but that would be John. John did not want to go home. And this is what he wrote in old age. As I did not wish to return, I applied to Colonel Stirling to use his influence to keep me out, and told him I wished to see some fun, and if I go home, I'll soon be ordered out again. On my asking him, he said, well, sir, you put that in monochrome. And I did so. An order came at once for me to remain out. My request was granted. And the following day, the old colonel said to me on the line of march, well, Orr, I'm glad to see you've some spunk in you. So John then writes about various, what they're doing for the next few months. The next entry, which I'm going to read, was the Battle of Salamanca, which was fought on the 22nd of July, 1812. And John writes after this, about 4 p.m., both armies came to close engagement. And about 6, victory favored the British. At 7, the French were in full retreat. They lost about 20,000 in killed, wounded, and prisoners. Marmont, that's their general, was wounded. In short, the French seldom or ever got such a drubbing. There was then, he was involved in the siege of Burgos, which was one of Wellington's mistakes. The retreat from there was terrible. The weather was very, very bad. They had no food. They were pressed by the French. And John writes on the 17th of November, 1812, I was on the baggage guard the same night Sir Edward Paget was taken prisoner, and I near sharing the same fate. I marched all night and next day, got into Rodrigo, many a dead animal and body on the road. After passing Rodrigo, we got into houses at night, which we stood much in need of, as the weather was very wet. Now, they spend the winter in Portugal. They then march north, and John is involved in various skirmishes with the French. But in November, he hears that his uncle has died, and as he's orphaned, it must be the main family member, so he asks if he has permission to return home, which he does. He then serves in Ireland, and then in May 1815, they are ordered there to Brussels for a confrontation with Napoleon. So this is the last reading I'll give you. It shows in a way, the horror of war. This is, I don't have a diary of him then. He may have written one, but I don't have it. So this is another note he wrote in old age. This is the Battle of Quatre Bras, which was fought 2 days before Waterloo. Wellington had sent them to safeguard the crossroads there, and the 42nd went with 2 other regiments. John writes, "At Quatre Bras, I commanded a company and did duty as adjutant. The enemy had a gun on our flank, and we were formed into a square. Man was tardy and slow in turning. I took hold of him by the arm and said, 'Come up, sir.' I felt the wind of a ball whiz through the air, and it struck the man, knocked his head off. The brains spattered about, some on my coat. The French cavalry were only a few yards off, and I gave a yell and shouted, 'Charge!' And we did so and drove them off." Well, I hope this gives you a little idea of what John was like in military life.
It did, and thank you very much. Did he then go on to fight at Waterloo 48 hours later?
Yes, he did. The 42nd suffered a lot of deaths and injuries at Quatre Bras, and so Wellington kept them in reserve. They had to lie down in the mud behind a hedge until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when they were ordered to stand and charge. And at some stage during this melee, John received a musket ball wound to a leg and was carried from the field. The next I hear of him is I have in the trunk a note from the hospital, if I can find it here. Yes, which says, "John Orr received on the 18th of June in action with the enemy a severe contusion of the left knee by a musket ball, which confined him to his bed for 3 weeks. His knee and leg were much inflamed. At present is considerably weaker and cannot march any distance without feeling great pain in his leg." But luckily he was fine by the time the regiment were recalled to Britain. They sailed in December that year, but it took them several months marching up through England and then through Scotland, arriving in Glasgow in September 1816.
I think, ladies and gentlemen, you're getting an impression that John Orr must have been a very lucky soldier to have survived all of the peninsula with one wounding, and then Quatre Bras and Waterloo with another. But he also must have had considerable fortitude, because he then marched a couple of months after the second wounding all the way back to Glasgow.
Yes.
What happened when he got there?
Well, the best thing that happened to John was he got married. Very soon, you find this, if you look into any of the histories of anybody, there were huge numbers of marriages very soon after Waterloo, when everyone got home. And he married Jane Pollock, her daughter of a merchant in Glasgow. But that was in December. But then sadly, in January of 2000, the next year, 17, the 42nd decided to they contracted, and John was put on the half-pension retired list. He was obviously very upset. I've got letters in the trunk about him trying to get a commission in various regiments. He eventually does get a commission in one regiment. It lasts 9 months, and that regiment was disbanded. He tries again, he gets another commission, it is disbanded. And so in 1821, he's retired again, but luckily, this time, he's retired on full pension. And he then has 10 years of really probably are rather unsatisfactory for him. He's obviously hoping he'll get some other service appointment. They move between Edinburgh and Glasgow, where they both have relations. And then in 1831, he's 41 by then, and he obviously realizes he's not going to get another appointment. So he joins the Edinburgh militia, and I'm lucky to have his militia uniform and gold bullion epaulets. I also chose not to bring the sword tonight. But, and so that's where I hand over to you now for another question.
So I think in the time that's available to us, we've probably covered John's military service, and I
Yes.
feel we should turn our attention for a little bit to the Scottish Naval
Indeed.
and Military Academy. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the Military Academy and how it came to exist.
Yes. Well, the SNMA was not the first military academy. That was started by Captain Scott in 1823. He was like John, he'd fought at Waterloo and he'd been retired. He almost taught and organized it himself. It was a huge success, but it was not surprising because he put so much into it that he died suddenly 2 years after it was started. And Edinburgh and Scotland were shocked. They were so pleased to have a military academy. They'd never had one before. And so the great and the good got together to start another one. The chief man was Sir Robert Kerr. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Kerr was Adjutant General. And he had a lot of contacts, and within a few weeks, they had raised enough money by public subscription to start a new organization. The vice chairman was Sir Henry Jardine, who was an excellent choice. He was a genial man with huge amounts of energy. He had many contacts in Edinburgh. Indeed, there's a contact here in that he was a great friend of Sir Walter Scott, and he was with Sir Walter Scott when they found the hidden Scottish regalia here in Edinburgh Castle.
So from poor old George Scott's demise, we can see there was a job vacancy. How did John Orr become the superintendent?
Well, they, unfortunately, for all their energy of starting it up, they chose the wrong man to be superintendent. Major Downes taught military drawing, but he was useless as a superintendent. The discipline broke down, boys behaving badly even in public, and eventually the directors got rid of him and appointed John in 1831.
So the directors of the SNMA clearly thought that John Orr was going to make a significant contribution. What sort of impact did he make?
Well, he made changes, but I think the most important thing that he gave was this odd mixture in his character of being a disciplinarian and having a warm personality. He had a sense of humor, and the boys respected this balance. They accepted the discipline because of his own personality. And they started behaving better. The Duke of Wellington became one of the presidents shortly after John joined, and King William IV, their patron. And it generally got better after that. But he was praised by the staff, who thought he was wonderful. They gave him a dinner, even in March, before the end of the session. And then I'll read you what the Jardine said about him at the praise giving after his first year. In Captain Orr, the directors believe they have found a gentleman possessed of the necessary qualifications. To great firmness, they observe that he unites the conduct and proper feelings of a gentleman, and they take this public opportunity of expressing the satisfaction which they observed, the zeal and unremitting attention which he has displayed in discharging his duties.
Thanks, Rosslyn. Apart from one or two military historians, I suspect there are very few people in the audience who could put their finger on where the Scottish Naval and Military Academy was. Can you tell us where it was,
Well,
Rosslyn?
of course, yes. It was in Lothian Road. almost on the west side, almost opposite the entrance to King Staples Road. What had happened a year before John joined, it was called the British, I've forgotten the name now.
Riding School, Royal Riding School.
It was the Royal Riding who started it.
Yeah.
It was the Royal Academy buildings.
Yeah.
And they had recently commissioned this building, and it was too big for them. And they were very happy to share it. It isn't there now. None of the buildings are there now, because some of you of a certain age will remember that there was a railway at the west end of Princes Street for a time. And so they demolished all the buildings there to bring the railway up there.
Now, it's called an academy, but it seems to me that it behaved quite like a school. Can you tell us a bit about what life during a day was at the school?
Yes, it was an unusual, as Euan says, it was basically in a way like a school. What was innovative was they decided from the beginning to take in pupils who were not having planning a military life. So they had some who were wanting to go on into services. These people had to take prescribed classes, and they had to pass them in order to get their certificate. Even the pupils who were not going for a civilian career were expected to do drill and military exercises. That was part, and gymnastics. I'm coming to gymnastics in a minute. The rest of the subjects were really the ones that you would find in any normal school, with the addition of Hindi Urdu for those going to the East India Company. I was always amused by the gymnastics. There's a very good quotation here, which I'm determined to read to you. This, funnily enough, comes from early on, just before the academy opened in October 1825. This was a piece written by the directors for a newspaper. They were planning to have gymnastics after the school finished at 4 o'clock, and anyone could join. Gymnastic exercises have not only been found extremely advantageous by gentlemen following military and naval professions, but are well known to tend much to the improvement and preservation of health. Gentlemen in every class of society, therefore, are interested in the present institution, especially those of a weakly constitution or of sedentary habits, to whom gymnastic exercises are particularly beneficial, and that's written 200 years ago. The best, I can't remember, do I go and talk about?
Gymnastic display at
yes,
prize giving.
That's right. The end of term prize giving, which happened in July on the last day of term, was a real opportunity for John to display his talents for organizing things. It wasn't just a prize giving. From the doors opened, eventually, I could get the order right, it was held in the music hall, recently finished in the mid-1840s. And the doors opened at 12, and the papers all talk about a grand array of elegant ladies arriving, because the afternoon before the prize giving, you had a display, a military display, you had a display of fencing, and you had a display of gymnastics. And it was enlivened by music from the gallery. This was played by the regiment, the band of the regiment that was stationed here in the castle. And they went to the Royal Academy buildings and went before, and the boys all marched along Lothian Road, along George Street, all part of the display. It was part of Edinburgh's social scene, which has been forgotten about.
Now, you mentioned in the book something called the Academy roll book, and it seems to me that this has been a rich seam of investigative possibilities.
Oh, I'm glad
for
you mentioned the roll book. I might have forgotten about the roll book. The roll book is the most important document in my cabin trunk. It's huge. It's this by this. It has 10 columns, and the boys, when they arrived in October, had to fill in the first columns, which was their name, their age, where they were living in Edinburgh, where they came from, who introduced them, which could be their parent, wasn't always their father, could have been the mother if the father was away on service. And the last column was filled in by John himself, and it was mainly about the military boys. And it's a great source of information. He describes whether it's what they're planning to do, not necessarily what they end up doing, but on the whole it is. It talks about the regiment, whether they're often naming the regiment, whether they're going to join the East India Company. And I entered all these 2,000 entries into an Excel spreadsheet, and it's enabled us to extract a lot of very interesting information. For instance, I thought at the start most of the boys there would come from Scotland, but no, only just over half came from Scotland. Others came from all over the place. Before I hand over to you again for a question, it shows that over 1,000 boys went into the services. And indeed, at this period of time, probably most regiments in the British Army had at least one boy who was educated there. And as I say, they didn't all come just from the empire as it was then, but I saw boys from Russia and Mexico. This became a really a well-known thing over the world.
Now, the academy didn't have any accommodation, so you mention in the book that John and his wife took in boarders.
Yes.
What was the family home like in Victorian
Well,
Edinburgh?
they were living in what would be a typical Georgian townhouse. It would have been very busy because they had 4 children themselves, 4 surviving children, 4 had died. They had James and John William, my great-grandfather, and 2 daughters, Maggie and Helen. I see from the census returns that they had 5 servants, which was not unusual in a Victorian household. There would have been a housekeeper, a cook, a housemaid who cleaned, a kitchen maid, and a dairy maid. And I said this to Melissa at one stage, and she said, well, the last 3 have been taken. We don't have them now because of the floor cleaner, the dishwasher, and the washing machine. But it must have been extremely busy. I was frustrated because although the cabin trunk, as you've seen, has produced some things, I had no letters from John and James, so I had no idea how the family actually worked. All I had, which gave a little bit of information, was for a few years I had John's letter book, which is a recording of his letters to parents and guardians, and that gave me a little information. I kept on thinking, oh, if only I could find somebody's account of staying there, and I kept searching boys and things, and then I struck lucky. One day I found online a book had been published with the edited diaries of Joseph Panton. And Joseph was a boy from Aberdeenshire who at age of 16 had come to stay with the Orrs in 1847 for 3 years. And I ordered the book and I opened it, and there one of the early chapters was all on staying with the Orr family. It was gold.
And that lucky discovery has given us the opportunity for you to perhaps tell us a little bit about what Joseph Panton said.
This is from my book. This is describing Joseph's first day in the Orr household. At his first dinner in the Orr's house, he was seated at Maggie's. I should explain that John's wife had died a few years before, and so Maggie, the oldest daughter, was then the kind of mate at the table. He was seated at Maggie's right hand, being the newest boarder. He anxiously looked around the table to see who else was there. He noticed the old captain at the other end, who had a twinkle in his eye. He was then both shocked and surprised as John suddenly opened his mouth and popped out his false teeth, and then smartly clicked them back in again and went on as if nothing had happened. Joseph didn't know what to think. He looked at John again and saw another twinkle in his eye. And Joseph then realized that he was going to enjoy living in the house because he knew the captain had a great sense of humor. Joseph described that the boys normally drank beer at dinner time, yet if there were guests or it was a special occasion, wine would be offered. Sometimes in the winter, hot whiskey toddy was served in a brown jug. Panton remarked that a person today, that he was finishing his diaries in 1916, might think too much alcohol was being served to such young men. He goes on to say, in those days, more alcohol was drunk by everyone. Well, I suppose these drinks were better than probably the water at the time. Then another one I want to read to you. There's another good Panton bit. Panton writes about how some of the older pupils would ask the old captain to join them if they were going out in the evening. He tells us about a night when some of the boys and John went to Mother Clark's restaurant in New Haven for a fish dinner. The favourite dish was crapet hyd, which was often eaten with haggis. Crapet hyd was the stuffed head of a cod or similar fish. The stuffing was made with oatmeal, onion, suet, fish liver and seasoning, and a walnut-sized piece was stuffed behind the eye sockets. It was originally cooked in seawater and was a popular Scottish dish. The best bits to come. Before they went to Mother Clark's, John said to Joseph and his friend Tom, "Panton, you and Tom Leith, remember, gentlemen, it's your duty to keep sober tonight, in order, if necessary, to carry me home on a shutter."
Now, the fact that Panton stayed there for 3 years and from those brief quotes was clearly a much-loved and involved pupil. I rather suspect there were more irksome students who stayed with the Orr family.
Yes. These stories of the problems come from that letter book I mentioned. Nothing changes much. One of the main problems was pocket money. A lot of the military pupils who were at John's were clearly and had to be the sons of wealthy people, because it costs such a huge amount to buy your commission. And a lot of these parents gave their children too much pocket money. And this is a story about one such boy. What has happened is that Thomas wants to give up practical mechanics, which is at 3 till 4 in the afternoon. He wants an extra hour off in the afternoon. And John is not pleased. He writes this letter to James, the father, James Pedder. He's a banker in Lancashire. "My dear sir, since your son's return to us, I am sorry to say that his general conduct is anything but satisfactory to me, and unless he improves and attends more to my directions, I will be under the necessity of requesting you to remove him from my house. I desired him to occupy his time from 3 to 4 at practical mechanics. But I have every reason to believe he has too great a command of money, and that his object is to idle along the streets, smoking cigars and drinking cherry brandy. You must be aware that from 3 to past 4 is by no means a desirable time for a young man to idle along Princes Street. And if he's allowed to have time to himself, I cannot be responsible for the evil habits he may contract. John is further bothered by his cost of clothes. He adds, I think him expensive in his wardrobe, and will thank you to give me some idea what you allow him yearly. He is not satisfied with the tailor I employ, but must get one more expensive. But luckily, things seem to have got better, because in a next letter, a month or two further on, he writes to James Pedder again, Mr. Thomas is in good spirits and seems attentive to his classes. I hope he will make a respectable appearance at our examination. So Thomas finishes, he goes into the army, he serves in New Zealand, and then he serves with the Hussars in the Crimea, but he's killed in action. It's the other thing that bothered students, the older students, was John's rules and regulations, which by the time they were 18, a lot of them found quite difficult. But on the whole, he got on very well with them.
Thank you, Rosslyn. As we know, books like this don't get written without a lot of research. And I wonder, to sort of round things off, if you could tell us a little bit about the research journey and things that might have helped you along the way.
Yes, it was a long journey. But the more I dug around getting research, the more things I found, the more motivated I became. I was thrilled with the stories I was getting about people. I had some trips which were useful. One in particular, I went to the Sandhurst and had a very good morning with the archivist there, Sebastian Puncher. It was extremely helpful. It helped me understand why the SNMA started to stop enrolling students in the 1850s, which had not been discovered before by historians. I think the best bit of helpful information from a personal writing point of view was a piece that Dame Mary Beard wrote as she was being interviewed about things that had helped her, and she said that the most important bit of advice she had been given was at university. She had written what she thought was a very good piece of work, and she'd sent it to her supervisor. Her supervisor asked her in, and he said, "This may be right, Mary, but it's bloody boring." And this is very valuable advice for anyone who writes. It's been a long journey, but I'm very pleased we've reached this bit. I'm proud of John and his military service. I'm even prouder of the numerous boys, both military and non-military, that came into his care in Scottish education. I think that's been forgotten about, really. I've become much fonder of John, but this is not a hagiography. John had his faults, but I'm very pleased to have reached this stage because the information about John and the Scottish Naval Military Academy is now in the public domain. And I look around tonight And I'm particularly grateful to a number of you who have helped me in this path. Without you, I wouldn't be where I am. And of course, I thank you all for coming out on a cold November night. Some questions from the floor now?
Rosslyn, I think you brought the Academy to life, but I haven't completely finished reading about the Academy, but I did wonder, how young or how old did the boys have to be before they were allowed entry? And also, I wondered, were they expected to stay for a particular length of time?
Oh, very good, thank you. Sorry about that, I didn't cover that. The average age was between 14 and 16, but there were boys who were much older came, where I think they were particularly wanting just their military things. Also, unusually, there were some boys who were 9, 10 or 11. John's children went there for 5 years, and they had certain classes like maths. They did 2 sets of classes, so they were able to cope with a wide range. That was unusual. Most boys came for a year. Quite a large proportion came for 2 years, but the standard was they had to come for at least 1 year.
When did the system of having to buy your commission into the British Army end?
I should ask who's drawn this. It was. Oh, thank you.
It's ended by the first Gladstone administration when Cardwell's Secretary at War in I think the final date is 1871. It's important to say, as Rosslyn's made clear, that not all commissions had to be bought before the abolition of purchase, because you could, as he did, be commissioned, of course, when the army was expanding. Then the need for officers and wartime demands especially, and wartime vacancies too. If a battalion was in the field and somebody was killed, then the next in seniority would. Yeah.
Rosslyn, that was marvellous, absolutely marvellous. You started off by saying you opened this magic box and you thought the things in here need to be archived. What happens to them now?
Well, they're still in my flat in Edinburgh, but I have just arranged that all the archival material that I've been talking about tonight is going to the Scottish National Records. And the uniform, like this, and the sword, and I have other things belonging to John, are all going to Scottish museums. So they'll be kept safe there. So I'm very relieved. It's not a problem Melissa and David need to face when I conk out.
Yep.
I'm going to be cheeky. I've got 2 questions.
Can't hear.
All right.
No, just...
I'll shout. 2 questions. 1, how did someone get to stay with him in his house? If there's lots of students coming and going, how did he pick who got to stay with them? Because they got wine, among other things. It's a pretty good gig. And 2, that spreadsheet of yours, that Excel spreadsheet that's got so much information in it, will that also be something that other people who are looking for their family history could research and find?
I think people just applied to come to the Academy, just like you would apply to join the Edinburgh Academy. There didn't seem to be, as far as, I have no record that there was any choice. As to the spreadsheet.
I think the question, Rosalind, was how did they get into John's house?
Well,
he and Jane, presumably.
All right. Well, they would apply to come to John. There are letters in the letter book replying to this, and he would take them in if he had space. If not, he had a list of other places they could lodge in, and he had to check them all to see if they were suitable for. He was expensive. It charged £100 for sharing a room, which was, I have the facts somewhere, but it was a large sum of money. You could get it cheaper for £60 at a sort of simpler place. The problem with it, yes, I've been just discussing this with the national records. It is, of course, all online at the moment. They will take physically the roll book. And they can't, they're still in two minds as to whether they can accept electronic data. And if they did, that people might not access it. My inclination is just to bang it up and online and let anyone have it. It's not fit for that yet, because I've been finding out things that are not. Annie here, wherever Annie is, Annie, Melissa's partner, is the great guru who has expanded my spreadsheet and has produced all this data that I now have. And it would be wonderful access to lots of people, so I want it to be out there.
Thank you. I would just echo what was said earlier. It was fascinating, and I think history on different levels, but to me part of the fun is the day-to-day experience of the guys who were there, and I really look forward to reading the book. I would also echo what your colleague said, and he must have been one lucky guy, fantastic survival to go from Salamanca to Waterloo and just have one bullet wound was great. So the two questions I have is, one, did he come from he had a burning desire, obviously, to follow a military career. Did he come from a military background family?
I mention that. He was the son of a jeweler. He's labelled as a jeweler, a goldsmith and a silversmith in the birth records of his children. I have found nothing much about him at all. The records in Greenock seem to have disappeared. I've been through there, I haven't found anything. And I think because he was labelled as being early orphaned, he probably had no money. He must have had connections to be commissioned into a militia, but that was sensible at the time if that was the way, because he couldn't afford to pay for a commission, and there was none of the urgencies that Hugh Strachan was talking about at that time. Until he joined.
I didn't quite hear the explanation. What was the relationship between the academy and Sandhurst? Was it active, or?
Sandhurst is a different type of educational establishment. It only produced, I think from Hugh Strachan's book, 20% about of officers in the British Army at that time. And so that was a surprise to me, because I'm not a historian nor a military historian, but I sort of thought that produced most of the officers, but it was only 20%. And there the education was, you had to go for 4 or 5 years. It was a proper school based on maths and classics with very little military education.
Can I just ask, maybe it's a final question. Between 1821 and 31, he's unemployed, as it were. Do you have any great sense of what he was actually up to in that decade?
Well,
was he just looking for work?
I think no, he wasn't looking for it. I mean, he was on a full pension, so he didn't really need to work. I have an addition to a marriage contract between him and Jane, and there's talk of properties in Glasgow, which I think he must have been involved in developing, probably with money from his wife. And I think that money funded him buying a townhouse in Edinburgh when he started to work. The only record of any hobby he had was woodworking. I have records twice of people mentioning he woodworked. But otherwise they visited family in both places, but I have no papers or anything from that period other than this marriage contract, addition to the marriage contract.
Just to go to me, sorry. If you met John Orr today, what question would you ask him?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think I would ask him would he have liked to have been in service longer? His military career was only 11 years, and I suspect that was where he really liked it. I have a letter, a newspaper cuttings book in the trunk, which has cuttings from the local papers, all about the prize givings and so on. And there's a prize giving one year, and it's the cuttings there with talk about everything. And John has written beside it, Salamanca Day, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. This was 30 years later. So his heart was really, I think, still in the military. So I think that would be my question.
Thank you, Dorothy. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we should probably draw things to a conclusion. Thank you very much for coming and supporting Rosslyn, but I'd also like to offer thanks to the trustees of the Scottish National War Memorial for allowing us to be in this extraordinary billion tonight. Thank you, Susan. And also to Historic Environment Scotland, whose job it is to preserve and maintain this building going forward. We wish them well with their work in preserving this unique memorial. But our greatest thanks are to you, Rosslyn, because your research and perseverance in producing this book has been dogged in the extreme. And you have illuminated something from the past for us in our day and generation that we would not otherwise have known about. And for that, we offer you enormous thanks. To revisit Mary Beard's Supervisor, I can tell you it is not bloody boring, this book. And once you read this book, I hope you will have the sort of feeling that is expressed in one of the early epigrams that Rosslyn quotes. And I'd just like to read it for you. It's taken from Richard Holmes' book, Sidetracks, and it simply says, "The great thing was simply to summon up for a moment a living, breathing space, to make the dead walk again, and to make the reader see a figure and to hear a voice." And you have undoubtedly done that, Rosslyn.